The sound was not merely a tear, it was a shriek. It was the high-pitched, agonizing scream of expensive fabric surrendering to brute force, a sound that sliced through the lazy afternoon silence like a gunshot. The crimson silk of the wrap dress Italian, hand-stitched, and the color of fresh arterial blood gave way. In a split second, the garment that had been a symbol of elegance was reduced to tattered ribbons fluttering in the breeze. The fabric pooled onto the unforgiving, oil-stained concrete of the sidewalk, a vibrant casualty in a gray, monochromatic world. Maya Vance did not scream. She did not gasp. She stood perfectly still, the cool air biting into her suddenly exposed skin, her lace bra now visible to the stunned suburban neighborhood. Looming over her was Officer Frank Miller. He was a mountain of trembling, unearned authority. He stood too close, invading her personal space with the aggressive entitlement of a man who has never been told no. The sour, cloying stench of stale tobacco, cheap gas station coffee, and nervous sweat radiated from his pores, assaulting Maya's senses even more than his physical proximity. His face was a mask of flushed, sweaty triumph, his eyes bulging slightly behind mirrored sunglasses that reflected Maya's stoic expression back at her. His hand, thick and calloused, still clenched the piece of red silk he had ripped from her body. He breathed heavily, a wet, rasping sound that betrayed his lack of physical fitness and his surplus of adrenaline. He leaned in, his lips brushing her ear, wet and repulsive. "See?" Miller whispered, his voice a gravelly slide of venom. "That's better. You were walking around here like a queen, but you're just another body." He paused, letting the humiliation sink in, or so he thought. "You need to learn your place," he hissed, emphasizing every word. "People like you don't get to look down on me, not in my town." To the neighbors peeking through their blinds, to Officer Reed snickering in the driver's seat of the cruiser, and certainly to Frank Miller, this looked like a victory. It looked like a police officer subduing a disorderly woman of color. It looked like the natural order of things in a town built on exclusion. But Miller made a fatal miscalculation. He was looking at Maya, but he wasn't seeing her. He saw a woman in her 30s with dark skin and a ruined dress. He did not see the ghost. He did not see the senior clandestine service officer who had spent the last 10 years dismantling terrorist cells in the Maghreb and toppling corrupt regimes in Eastern Europe. He didn't see the woman who had once endured 3 days of interrogation in a black site without blinking, let alone crying over a piece of clothing. And most terrifyingly, he had absolutely no idea that the woman he had just assaulted was the only daughter of Jonathan Vance. Jonathan Vance, the United States federal prosecutor known in the darkest corridors of Washington, D.C. as the guillotine. A man who didn't just win cases. He vaporized the lives of those who crossed him. Miller smirked, dropping the piece of silk onto the ground and grinding it into the dirt with the heel of his boot. He thought he was teaching a lesson to a helpless girl. In reality, Officer Frank Miller had just signed his own death warrant, and the ink was already dry. 30 minutes before the violence, Oak Creek had been a portrait of American perfection. It was a place where the lawns were manicured with surgical precision, the oak trees formed cathedral-like arches over the streets, and the silence was a commodity that cost millions to acquire. This was the sanctuary of old money, a fortress of wealth where problems were solved with checkbooks and hushed phone calls, never with raised voices. For Maya Vance, this silence was medicinal. She walked down the sidewalk, the rhythmic click of her heels the only sound accompanying the rustle of leaves. She carried a leather tote bag filled with artisanal cheese, fresh berries, and a bottle of vintage wine-simple domestic treasures that felt alien in her hands. For a decade, her hands had held Glocks, encrypted satellite phones, and dossiers on high-value targets. Now, they held groceries. She was on mandatory leave. Compassionate burnout prevention, her handler at Langley had called it. After the extraction in Kiev went sideways, after the explosion that had nearly taken her hearing in her left ear, the agency had forced her into the shadows of suburbia. "Just breathe, Maya," she told herself, inhaling the scent of jasmine and freshly cut grass. Be normal. Be boring. She had chosen the dress carefully for this outing. It was a wrap dress of deep, vibrant crimson silk. It wasn't tactical gear. It wasn't gray or black or designed to blend into a crowd. It was bold. It was feminine. It was a declaration that she was alive, that she was a woman, not just a weapon. The silk felt like cool water against her skin, a stark contrast to the Kevlar and rough fatigues that had been her second skin for so long. Wearing it felt like an act of rebellion against the trauma she carried. She was starting to feel at the peace. The tension in her shoulders was beginning to unfurl. Then, the mechanical growl shattered the illusion. It started as a low rumble, then grew into the guttural, aggressive idle of a V8 engine. A police cruiser, black and white, rolled up alongside her. It didn't pass. It matched her pace, stalking her. Maya didn't look over immediately. Her training kicked in situational awareness level yellow. She cataloged the vehicle without turning her head. Unit 402. Mud on the wheel wells. A dent in the front bumper. The car window whirred down. "Well, now, what have we here?" The voice was thick, dripping with a mixture of unearned authority and lecherous curiosity. Maya stopped. She turned slowly, her face composed, betraying nothing. Leaning out of the passenger window was Officer Frank Miller. He was a caricature of a bad cop. He was thick-set, his neck spilling over the collar of his uniform, his skin a blotchy map of sunburns and burst capillaries from too much cheap whiskey and too many years of unchecked anger. He wore mirrored aviator sunglasses, shielding his eyes, but she could feel his gaze crawling over her body like insects. Behind the wheel sat his partner, Officer Reed. He was the opposite of Millerthin, Weasley, with a nervous energy that manifested in a constant, twitchy tapping on the steering wheel. He looked like the kind of man who laughed at jokes he didn't understand, just to be part of the pack. "A little lost, sweetheart?" Miller asked, a smirk playing on his lips. Maya tightened her grip on her tote bag. She had met men like Miller in every corner of the globe. Warlords in Somalia, corrupt border guards in Venezuela, cartel enforcers in Mexico. They all shared the same DNA, the bully who only feels tall when he is standing on someone else's neck. "Not at all, officer," Maya replied. Her voice was polite, but it held the temperature of liquid nitrogen. "I live just around the corner." Reed chuckled from the driver's seat, a high nasal sound. "She lives around the corner, Frank, you hear that?" Miller didn't laugh. He opened the car door and hauled his bulk out of the vehicle. The suspension groaned in relief as he stepped onto the sidewalk. He hitched up his utility belt, the leather creaking, and took a step toward her. He was trying to use his size to intimidate, blocking the sun, casting a shadow over her. "Live here, huh?" Miller's head tilted, his mirrored lenses scanning her from the intricate braids of her hair, down the column of her neck, lingering obscenely on the curve of her chest beneath the red silk, before finally reaching her heels. "Don't see many of your kind in Oak Creek," Miller drawled, taking another step closer. The smell hit her then-old sweat, stale donuts, and the metallic tang of a man who didn't take care of himself. "Especially not dressed like you're heading to a Hollywood premiere or a street corner." The insult was thinly veiled, wrapped in the guise of police work. "I wasn't aware there was a dress code for walking in my own neighborhood," Maya said. She did not step back. This was the first test. Predators look for movement. They look for the flinch. Maya Vance did not flinch. Miller's smirk widened, revealing yellowed teeth. He mistook her stillness for paralysis. "A pretty thing like you," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, oily whisper. "In a dress like that red, it screams for attention. You must be looking for a certain kind of attention. He stepped into her personal zone, crossing the invisible line of social decency. I bet you're looking for a sponsor, a nice rich man to pay the rent. Is that it? I'm happy to give you some attention, Miller continued, his hand resting casually, threateningly, near his baton. My shift ends in an hour. How about you and I get to know each other? I can show you what real authority looks like. Maybe I can help you with that rent situation. It was a proposition and a threat, twisted together. Maya's eyes, dark and polished like obsidian, hardened. She accessed the command voice, a technique she had used to de-escalate hostage situations and direct tactical teams under fire. It wasn't shouting. It was a tone of absolute, non-negotiable finality. I will have to decline, officer, she said. I have plans, and you are obstructing my path. Miller blinked. The rejection hit him like a physical slap. He wasn't used to women speaking to him like this. He was used to fear, to stuttering apologies, to tears. He was used to being the king of Oak Creek. Plans? Miller barked, his face flushing a deeper shade of red. Don't lie to me, I know your type. You come into a nice neighborhood like this, shaking everything you've got, thinking the rules don't apply to you? He lunged forward, his hand shooting out to grab her upper arm. His grip was like a vice, fingers digging into her bicep hard enough to bruise. We're the ones in charge here, Miller snarled. Maya looked at his hand on her arm. She calculated the pressure. She calculated the angle. She could have broken his wrist in 3 places before he drew his next breath. She could have driven her palm into his nose, sending cartilage into his brain. Her body hummed with the potential for violence. But she held back. She was a civilian today, and civilians didn't break cops' arms. Instead, she looked up at him, her gaze boring into his own reflection in his glasses. Take your hand off me, she ordered, low, dangerous. This is your last warning. Miller froze. For a second, the predator in him sensed a bigger predator, but his ego was too loud, too fragile. He couldn't back down now, not in front of Reed, not in front of a woman of color who dared to give him orders. Or what? Miller laughed, looking back at Reed. You gonna call the police? He turned back to her, his face contorted with rage. The mask of the flirtatious cop fell away, revealing the monster underneath. You think you can talk to me like that? Miller shouted, his spit flying onto her cheek. You need to be taught a lesson. You need to learn some respect. His free hand reached out, not for her arm this time, but for the neckline of the red dress. The air between them seemed to curdle, thickening with a toxicity that was almost palpable. Officer Miller had stepped fully onto the sidewalk now, his heavy boots invading the sanctuary of her personal space. He was close enough that the heat radiating from his sun-baked uniform felt like a physical weight against her skin. It wasn't just his proximity that was a violation. It was the sensory assault that came with it. As he leaned in, a wave of nausea-inducing stench washed over Maya. It was the stale, acrid odor of cheap cigarette smoke that had settled deep into the polyester weave of his shirt, layered over the sour tang of old sweat and the burnt chemical smell of gas station coffee that had been sitting on a burner for 6 hours. It was the smell of a man who was rotting from the inside out. He towered over her, deliberately using his bulk to block out the sun, casting her in his shadow. You need to learn some respect, Miller repeated, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated in her chest. Maya didn't retreat. She didn't blink. Her peripheral vision, honed by years of surviving in hostile environments, scanned the perimeter. Across the street, Mrs. Higgins, the elderly woman who usually waved when Maya walked by, was suddenly engrossed in pruning her hydrangeas, her back turned rigidly toward the scene. 2 doors down, a man washing his Tesla paused, looked directly at Miller bullying a woman on the sidewalk, and then simply turned his hose back to the wheel wells, choosing the path of least resistance. The silence of the neighborhood was deafening. It was a conspiracy of apathy, In Oak Creek, peace was maintained by looking the other way. Miller saw her glance around. He mistook her tactical assessment for a search for help. "Nobody's coming to help you, sweetheart," he sneered, a piece of spittle landing on her collarbone. "Out here, I'm the only god you need to worry about." He reached out. His hand, thick and rough like a catcher's mitt, clamped onto her upper arm. His fingers dug in, finding the soft flesh between the muscles, squeezing with a pressure that was designed to bruise, designed to elicit a cry of pain. It was an assault, plain and simple. The CIA operative inside Maya Vance woke up fully. Her heart rate didn't spike, it steadied. Her breathing didn't hitch, it deepened. The world slowed down into high-definition clarity. She looked down at his hand on her arm, the dirty fingernails, the cheap gold wedding band cutting into his flesh, and then she looked up into his mirrored sunglasses. "Remove your hand," Maya said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried the absolute freezing temperature of liquid nitrogen. "This is your final warning. You are making a mistake that you cannot undo." To a rational man, the tone of her voice would have been terrifying. It was the tone of a predator giving prey a sporting chance to run. But Frank Miller was not a rational man. He was a bully whose ego was as fragile as spun glass. Her refusal to submit, her audacity to warn him, shattered his composure. He turned back to Reed, who was watching from the cruiser with a jagged, nervous grin. "Did you hear that, Reed?" Miller laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "She's warning me." He turned back to Maya, and the laughter vanished instantly, replaced by a flush of ugly crimson rage that mottled his neck. "You think you're tough?" Miller hissed. "You think because you walk around in this fancy neighborhood with your nose in the air that you're untouchable? You're nothing. You're just a body, and bodies can be broken." He didn't go for her arm again. He went for her dignity. His hand shot out, grabbing the V neckline of the crimson silk wrap dress. He bunched the expensive, delicate fabric in his fist, twisting it to get a solid grip. Maya's eyes widened slightly. For the first time, she wasn't calculating angles of attack. She was bracing for the violation. "Let's see what you're hiding underneath all that arrogance," Miller growled. He yanked. Hard. "Ripe!" The sound was singular and violent, tearing through the quiet afternoon like a scream. It was the sound of destruction. The Italian silk, woven with care and designed to make a woman feel beautiful, surrendered to the brute force of his rage. The dress didn't just tear, it disintegrated. The bodice was ripped open from her left shoulder all the way down to her waist, the wrap tie mechanism shearing off completely. Time seemed to suspend in a sickening, slow-motion freeze frame. The red fabric fluttered away from her body like the wings of a dying bird, landing in a crumpled heap on the oil-stained asphalt. Suddenly, the cool afternoon breeze wasn't refreshing. It was an assault. It bit into her exposed skin. Maya stood there, stripped of her armor, her lace bra and her stomach exposed to the leering eyes of Officer Miller, Officer Reed, and the entire neighborhood. Her tote bag slipped from her shoulder. It hit the ground with a heavy, wet thud. The bottle of vintage Pinot Noir shattered instantly. The dark red wine exploded outward, splashing across the pristine concrete sidewalk and soaking the hem of Miller's trousers. It looked horrifyingly like a pool of fresh arterial blood expanding at their feet. The artisanal cheese rolled into the gutter. The carton of raspberries burst open. The delicate fruit crushed into a red smear under Miller's heavy boot as he shifted his weight. The scene was a tableau of utter devastation. A woman, half naked and violated. A man panting with the exertion of his cruelty, and the ground stained red between them. Miller stared at her chest. His eyes didn't hold an ounce of shame. They held a sick, triumphant glint. He looked like a man who had just broken a wild horse. "There," Miller breathed, his voice thick with a perverse satisfaction. He gestured vaguely at her exposed body with his free hand. "That's better." Now you look the part. Now you look like what you really are." He waited for the breakdown. He waited for her to cover herself with her hands, to drop to her knees, to sob, to beg for mercy or a jacket. He wanted her shame. He needed it to feed the empty black hole where his soul should have been. But Maya Vance did not move to cover herself. She did not cry. She did not scream. Slowly, terrifyingly slowly, she raised her head. The shock in her eyes evaporated, replaced by a void so deep and cold it should have frozen Miller where he stood. The Banshee, her code name in the field, had just taken the wheel. She wasn't looking at a police officer anymore. She was looking at a target. Subject, male, Caucasian, late 30s, overweight, compromised emotional control. Her mind, honed by a decade of black ops training, began to photograph the scene with forensic precision. She didn't see a badge, she saw a number. Officer Miller, badge number 402. She shifted her gaze to the car. Officer Reed, driver, badge number 405, complicit. She memorized the scratch on Miller's watch face, the scar above his left eyebrow, the specific way his holster sat too low on his hip. She was filing away every pixel of his existence into a dossier labeled termination. "You!" Miller scoffed, unsettled by her silence, trying to regain the momentum. "You got nothing to say now? Cat got your tongue?" He grabbed her shoulder, the bare skin this time, and spun her around with violent force. "Turn around!" he barked. "Hands behind your back! You are under arrest for public indecency and assaulting a police officer!" He slammed her chest first onto the hood of the cruiser. The metal was scorching hot from the engine, burning her exposed skin, but Maya didn't flinch. She barely felt it. Her mind had detached from her body. She was floating above the scene, a silent observer planning the destruction of an enemy. Miller grabbed her wrists. He didn't just cuff her, he weaponized the restraints. He ratcheted the steel cuffs down onto her slender wrists with malicious force. Click, click, click. He kept squeezing, forcing the metal loops tighter and tighter until they bit through the skin. She felt the sharp pinch as the steel cut into her flesh, grinding against the bone. A trickle of warm blood, real blood this time, ran down her hand, dripping off her fingertips onto the hot hood of the car. "Too tight?" Miller whispered in her ear, leaning his heavy body against her back, pinning her down. "Good. It's supposed to hurt. That's how you remember who's in charge." He yanked her arms upward, straining her shoulder sockets to the breaking point. "You're going to jail, sweetheart," Miller hissed, his breath hot on her neck. "And by the time we're done with you, you're going to wish you'd never set foot in Oak Creek." Maya rested her cheek against the hot metal of the car. She watched the red wine pooling in the gutter, mixing with the crushed berries. "Badge 402, she repeated in her mind, a mantra of doom. "Badge 405. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The time for words had passed when the silk tore. Officer Miller thought he had just handcuffed a helpless woman. He thought he had won. He had no idea that he had just handcuffed himself to a hurricane. The back of the police cruiser was a master class in engineered discomfort. The hard plastic seat was molded to force the body into an unnatural, cramped hunch, a design specifically intended to strip a detainee of their dignity before they even arrived at the station. Maya Vance sat wedged in the corner, her hands cuffed tightly behind her back. The steel bit into her wrists with every bump in the road, sending fresh jolts of fire up her arms. The air in the cage smelled of old vinyl, dried sweat, and the lingering coppery scent of someone else's blood, the ghosts of previous victims who had ridden in this mobile purgatory. Through the plexiglass divider, the voices of Officer Miller and Officer Reed filtered back to her, distorted but loud enough to be heard. They weren't silent. They were laughing. "Did you see her face?" Reed chortled, his nervous energy from the sidewalk now replaced by the bravado of the safe zone. "She actually thought she could order us around." Miller was driving with one hand, the other holding the radio mic. He was composing the narrative of Maya's destruction in real time, rewriting history before the ink was even dry. "Dispatch, this is Unit 402, Miller said, his voice dropping into a practiced, serious register that sounded nothing like the monster who had just ripped a woman's clothes off. "Suspect in custody. We have a female, African American, approximately 30 years of age, combatant." He paused, glancing at Reed with a wink. "Subject appears to be under the influence of narcotics, PCP or meth. Erratic behavior, screaming profanities, physically assaulted an officer during the stop." Maya listened, her face pressed against the cold window. She didn't shout. She didn't protest. The CIA operative in her the ghost had taken full control. She wasn't a prisoner. She was an intelligence asset deep behind enemy lines. Miller continued, adding the final brushstroke to his masterpiece of lies. "Also, be advised, subject is partially undressed, public indecency. She was soliciting traffic on the corner. We had to restrain her for her own safety." Soliciting. The word hung in the stale air of the cruiser. He wasn't just arresting her, he was dismantling her character. He was painting her as a drug-addicted sex worker to ensure that no judge, no jury, and no internal affairs officer would ever look past the mugshot. It was a script. They had done this 100 times before. Maya's eyes narrowed. She wasn't memorizing the lies to argue them later. She was memorizing them to use as ammunition. Every falsehood was a count on the indictment she was drafting in her mind. Obstruction of justice, filing a false report, conspiracy to deprive civil rights. The cruiser turned sharply, throwing her against the door. The Oak Creek Police Precinct came into view. It was a squat, ugly building of gray brick, looking more like a fortress than a public service center. They pulled into the Sally Port. The heavy steel gate rolled down behind them with a finality that echoed in Maya's bones. "Welcome to the castle, Princess," Miller sneered as he hauled her out of the car. He gripped her arm, right on the bruise he had already made, and marched her through the heavy metal doors. If the neighborhood of Oak Creek was a paradise, its police station was the sewer that ran beneath it. The air hit Maya like a physical blow-a-thick, suffocating soup of industrial-grade pine cleaner, trying and failing to mask the underlying stench of unwashed bodies, urine, and fear. The lighting was harsh, buzzing fluorescent tubes that cast everything in a sickly green-tinged pallor. The linoleum floors were scuffed and stained, a map of misery. Miller paraded her through the booking area. This was the walk of shame, a ritual designed to break the spirit. "Look what the cat dragged in," a desk sergeant muttered, looking up from his computer. He didn't look at Maya's face. He looked at her torn dress, at the exposed lace of her bra, and let out a low whistle. Other officers paused their conversations. They didn't look shocked. They didn't rush to cover her up or ask why a woman was bleeding from the wrists. They looked at her with a mixture of leering lust and cold contempt. To them, she wasn't a human being. She was the trophy from Miller's hunt. "Rough afternoon, Frank?" one officer called out, sipping coffee. "She likes to fight," Miller bragged, shoving Maya forward so she stumbled. "Had to teach her some manners." Maya met their eyes, one by one. She didn't look down. She looked at their name tags: Officer Davis, Sergeant O'Malley, Officer Klein, complicit. All of them. The blue wall of silence wasn't just a metaphor here. It was the foundation of the building. They shoved her into a holding cell at the end of the hall. It was a concrete box, 5 feet by 8 feet. A stainless steel toilet sat in the corner, rimmed with filth. The bench was a slab of cold metal bolted to the wall. "Get comfortable," Miller said, unlocking the cuffs. "You're going to be here a long time." He slammed the barred door. The clang was deafening. Maya sat on the bench. She rubbed her wrists, where the skin was raw and weeping blood. She took a deep breath, regulating her heart rate. She was in the belly of the beast. Now she just had to wait for the head to show itself. It didn't take long. 30 minutes later, the atmosphere in the cell block shifted. The loud, boisterous laughter of the patrol officers died down instantly. The air grew tense, heavy with a different kind of fear. Footsteps approached, not the heavy, clomping boots of Miller, but the soft, rhythmic click of expensive leather shoes on linoleum. A man appeared outside her cell. He didn't look like a cop. He looked like a CEO, or perhaps a shark in human clothing. Chief Evans was a man in his late 40s with silver hair coiffed to perfection and a face that was handsome in a cold, reptilian way. He wore a bespoke Navy suit that probably cost more than Officer Miller made in 6 months. There was no lint on his jacket, no scuff on his shoes. He was immaculate. He stood looking at Maya through the bars. He didn't leer like Miller. He studied her with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining a specimen in a jar. "Maya Vance," Evans said. His voice was smooth, a rich baritone that sounded reasonable, almost kind. "I've been reading your file, or rather, the file Officer Miller just started for you." He held up a clipboard. "Assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, public intoxication, solicitation, indecent exposure." He shook his head slowly, a performance of disappointed paternalism. "It's a very ugly picture, Ms. Vance. Very ugly indeed." Maya stood up and walked to the bars. She looked him in the eye. "It's a work of fiction," she said calmly. "And you know it." Evans smiled. It was a thin, humorless stretching of his lips that didn't reach his cold blue eyes. "Fiction?" Evans chuckled softly. "You're new here, aren't you? You don't understand how Oak Creek works." He stepped closer, the smell of expensive cologne wafting into the cell, overpowering the smell of bleach. "You see, Maya," he said, using her first name with a familiarity that made her skin crawl. "In this town, the truth isn't what happened. The truth is what I decide to write on this piece of paper." He tapped the clipboard with a manicured finger. "I run this town. The judges play golf with me on Sundays. The prosecutor owes me his re-election. The mayor is my brother-in-law." He was laying it out for her. The architecture of his corruption. He felt so safe, so untouchable, that he didn't even bother to code his language. "So," Evans continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, "I'm going to offer you a choice, a courtesy." He pulled a pen from his pocket. "Option A. You sign a confession. Disorderly conduct, a misdemeanor. You pay a fine, you spend the night, and tomorrow morning you get in your car and you leave Oak Creek. You never come back. You disappear." He paused, letting the offer hang in the air. It was the devil's deal, the easy way out, the path of submission. "And option B?" Maya asked, her voice steady. The mask slipped. For a fraction of a second, the urbane politician vanished, and the tyrant appeared. "Option B," Evans said, his eyes turning to ice. "The charges stick. All of them. I'll add a few more. Possession with intent to distribute. We found some powder in your purse, didn't we? Assault with a deadly weapon, Miller, has a bruise." He leaned in until his forehead was touching the cold steel bars. "You'll go to county. Your bail will be set so high, you'll rot in there for months before you even see a courtroom. Evidence will get lost. Witnesses will disappear. Or maybe—" He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her torn dress. "Maybe you'll have an accident in custody. People get hurt in jail, Maya. Especially women who don't know their place." "Even the best lawyer in the world can't fight a ghost, Ms. Vance," he whispered. "And in my town, I am the one who haunts you." It was a master class in systemic intimidation. He wasn't just threatening her freedom, he was threatening her existence. He was telling her that the machinery of justice was broken, and he was the one holding the wrench. Maya looked at him. She didn't see a powerful man. She saw a target-rich environment. "You've built quite a machine, Chief," Maya said softly. There was no fear in her voice, only a strange, cold appreciation. "You've covered every angle." Evans mistook her analysis for admiration or perhaps resignation. He straightened up, buttoning his jacket. "I prefer to call it maintaining order," he said smoothly. "Oak Creek is a quiet town. We like to keep it that way. We don't like disruptive elements." He placed the clipboard on the small ledge of the cell door bars. "I'll give you an hour to think about it. Be smart, Maya. Don't be a martyr. Martyrs end up dead. Smart girls end up going home." He turned and walked away, his shoes clicking rhythmically on the floor. He moved with the arrogance of a man who had never lost. Maya watched him go. She waited until he turned the corner and the heavy door to the administrative wing closed behind him. Then, she sat back down on the bench. Evans thought he had locked her in a cage. He thought he had given her an ultimatum that would crush her spirit. He didn't realize that his threat was the most valuable piece of intelligence she had received yet. He had just confessed to conspiracy, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and racketeering. He had confirmed that the corruption wasn't just Miller being a thug. It was a top-down criminal enterprise. Maya reached her hand up to the collar of her torn dress. Her fingers brushed against the small, pearlescent button near the top, the only one that had survived Miller's assault. It wasn't a button. It was a CIA-issue Series 9 micro-recorder, capable of capturing high-fidelity audio even through layers of interference. It had been recording since she left her house. It had recorded Miller's slurs. It had recorded the sound of the dress ripping. It had recorded the lies in the cruiser. And now, it had recorded Chief Evans laying out the blueprints of his own destruction. Maya allowed a small, terrifying smile to touch her lips. "Order," she whispered to the empty cell. "You want order, Chief? I'll give you order." She leaned her head back against the concrete wall. The pain in her wrists was throbbing, a dull roar that sharpened her focus. They thought she was trapped in here with them. They were wrong. They were trapped in here with her. The hours in the holding cell stretched into a suffocating eternity. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a headache-inducing frequency, dissolving the concept of time. Day turned to night, marked only by the shift change of the guards and the deepening shadows in the corners of the cell block. Maya sat on the edge of the metal cot, her posture slumped. To the camera mounted in the corner, she looked defeated, a woman broken by the weight of the system. But beneath the curtain of her hair, her eyes were open, alert, and scanning. She was mapping the routine of the station, the heavy footsteps of the booking sergeant every 40 minutes, the squeak of the janitor's cart, the distant ring of phones. Her stomach growled, a sharp reminder that she hadn't eaten since before the silk tour. At 7 p.m., the heavy steel door at the end of the corridor clanked open. A young officer walked in carrying a plastic tray. It wasn't Miller. It wasn't the shark-like Chief Evans. It was Officer Davis, badge number 412. Maya had clocked him earlier during the booking process. He was young, maybe 25, with eyes that darted nervously and shoulders that slumped as if the uniform he wore was too heavy for his conscience. Unlike the others, who looked at her with lust or contempt, Davis had looked at the floor. He stopped at her cell bars. He didn't sneer. He didn't make a crude joke. "Dinner," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. He slid the tray through the slot. It was a pathetic offering, a dry sandwich wrapped in cellophane and a styrofoam cup of lukewarm water. "Eat up," Davis said, his voice suddenly louder, performing for the microphones. "Chief says no special treatment." But as he withdrew his hand, his fingers lingered on the tray for a fraction of a second too long. He tapped the underside of the sandwich twice, a distinct, deliberate signal. Maya didn't react immediately. She waited until Davis had walked away, his boots retreating down the hall. She waited another 5 minutes, ensuring the camera hadn't zoomed in. Then, with the sleight of hand of a magician, she tore open the sandwich. There, tucked between the dry bread and a slice of processed cheese, was a small, folded scrap of receipt paper. Maya shielded it with her body, unfolding it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was scribbled, hurried, written in the frantic scrawl of a man terrified of being caught. Camera in West Hallway loops every 20 mins. Blind spot at 02:00 a.m. for 10 mins during server reset. Maintenance door in the rear sally port has a faulty latch. Kick the bottom panel. Go. Contact Ben Carter, investigative journalist, 555-0192. Tell him you have the Evans tape. Maya swallowed the lump in her throat. Officer Davis. In a den of wolves, she had found a sheepdog. He was risking his career, perhaps his life, to give her a fighting chance. She memorized the number instantly, 50192, and the time 02 a.m. Then she tore the paper into confetti-sized pieces, put them in her mouth, and swallowed them with a gulp of water. The intelligence was good, but to make it work, she needed a diversion. She needed them to believe she was no longer a threat. She needed to put on the performance of a lifetime. The next morning, the sun filtered through the high, barred windows, casting jail bar shadows across the floor. When Officer Miller and Officer Reed strolled into the cell block for their morning rounds, they found a very different Maya Vance. The stoic, defiant woman who had issued warnings on the sidewalk was gone. In her place was a shivering, weeping mess. Maya was curled in the corner of the bunk, her knees pulled to her chest, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please," she wailed as they approached, her voice cracking. "Please, I just want to go home. I'm sorry. I'll sign whatever you want." Miller's face lit up with a grin that was pure, unadulterated malice. He elbowed Reed. "Told you," Miller gloated. "They all break, even the fancy ones." He rattled his baton against the bars, enjoying the way she flinched. "Aw, look at that," Reed chuckled, leaning in. "She's crying. Where's all that big talk now, huh? Where's the final warning?" Maya looked up, tears streaming down her face, her eyes wide with manufactured terror. "I was scared," she stammered. I didn't know who I was dealing with. Chief Evans, he said I'd disappear. Please, don't let him hurt me." Her submission was like a drug to them. It fed their egos, loosening their tongues. They relaxed, leaning against the bars, confident in their absolute dominance. "You're damn right you didn't know," Miller bragged, puffing out his chest. "Chief Evans runs this county. You think you're the first troublemaker we've had to correct? Remember that college kid last year?" Reed chimed in, eager to impress his partner. "The one who tried to file a complaint about the traffic stops? We planted enough coke in his trunk to put him away for 10 years. Judge signed the warrant before we even opened the car." "Or the construction foreman," Miller added, laughing, "refused to pay the protection fee for his site security. Funny how his equipment shed burned down the next night. Chief Evans calls it urban renewal." Maya buried her face in her hands, sobbing louder to cover the sound of her sharp intake of breath. Keep talking, she thought, her mind a cold, silent recorder behind the mask of tears. Give me everything. "We run this town," Miller said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The evidence locker, it's our personal piggy bank. The seizures, our bonuses, and nobody can touch us. Not the state police, not the feds. We are the law. So you just sign the paper," Reed said, tapping the bars. "Be a good girl, and maybe we won't have to visit you in your cell tonight." They laughed again, a sound that made Maya's skin crawl, and walked away, high on their own power. As soon as they were out of sight, Maya dropped her hands. The tears stopped instantly. Her face smoothed out, the terror vanishing to reveal the hardened resolve of the banshee. Her hand moved to the collar of her torn dress. Her fingers found the small pearlescent button. CIA Series 9 micro recorder. It had captured every word, the confession of planting drugs, the arson, the extortion, the corruption of the judiciary. They had just handed her a loaded gun. Now she just needed to get out of the cage to pull the trigger. 01:55 a.m. The station was quiet, settling into the graveyard shift. The air was heavy with the hum of the ventilation system. Maya stood by the cell door. She had pulled the underwire from her bra thin, high-tensile steel strip. It wasn't a standard lockpick, but in the hands of a woman trained to escape North Korean restraints, it was a skeleton key. She waited. Somewhere in the distance, a fire alarm blared. Davis. "Fire in the East Wing! Document storage!" a voice shouted. Boots thundered down the hallway as the few night shift officers scrambled toward the fake emergency. This was the window. Maya inserted the wire into the lock mechanism. She worked by feel, her eyes closed, visualizing the tumblers. Click, click, click. The final tumbler gave way with a soft snick. She pushed the door. It swung open. She was out. She moved like smoke. Barefoot, ignoring the cold bite of the linoleum, she sprinted toward the west hallway. She counted the seconds in her head. The server reset loop. "I have 4 minutes left." She reached the rear sally port. The maintenance door was there, unassuming, painted a dull gray. She knelt, inspecting the latch. Davis was right. It was rusted. She didn't kick it immediately. She timed it with the pulsing of the fire alarm. Beep, kick, beep, kick. On the third strike, the latch sheared. The door popped open. The night air hit her face humid, smelling of wet asphalt and freedom. Maya slipped out into the alleyway. She didn't look back. She ran. She ran with the torn silk of her dress flapping around her legs, her bare feet slapping against the pavement, cutting her soles on gravel and glass. She didn't feel the pain. She felt only the drive of the mission. She navigated the back streets of Oak Creek, a ghost moving through the shadows of the mansions. She found the location Davis had indicated, a 24-hour diner on the edge of town called the Rusty Spoon. She didn't go in. She circled to the back near the dumpster, where a payphone box stood, a relic of a bygone era. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline crash beginning to set in. She fumbled in the pocket of the dress. She had managed to swipe a quarter from the intake tray at the station during booking, a small sleight of hand Miller hadn't noticed. She didn't call Ben Carter yet. She needed authorization. She needed extraction. She needed her people. She dialed the emergency breakdown number for her handler, Director Peterson. It rang once, twice. "Line secure." "Report," a voice answered. It was crisp, familiar. Peterson. "Director," Maya whispered, pressing herself into the shadows of the brick wall. "This is Vance. Status. Critical. I've been compromised. Local law enforcement in Oak Creek is a hostile entity. I have evidence of systemic corruption, racketeering, and federal crimes. I've escaped custody. I need immediate extraction. Requesting a clean team to my location." There was a silence on the line. It wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of calculation. "Vance," Peterson said. His voice was different. It lacked the urgency of a handler protecting his agent. It sounded bureaucratic, cold. "I received a call from a Chief Evans about 3 hours ago," Peterson said. Maya's blood froze. "He ran your name through a back channel," Peterson continued. "He claims you are mentally unstable, drug-induced psychosis, assaulting officers." "He's lying," Maya hissed. "I have him on tape, Peterson. I have them all on tape." "They're criminals." "Chief Evans is a strategic asset for the senator," Peterson said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Oak Creek is a sensitive political zone. We cannot have a CIA operative causing a domestic scandal during an election year." "Sir, they assaulted me," Maya said, her voice trembling with a dawning horror. "They stripped me. They beat me." "You are on administrative leave, Agent Vance." Peterson cut her off sharply. "You have no authority. You have no mission." "I am asking for help," Maya pleaded. "I am asking for my team." "Stand down, Maya," Peterson ordered. "That is a direct order. Turn yourself in. Let the locals handle it. If you escalate this, if you release any tapes..." The agency will disavow you. You will be on your own. Do not make this a federal incident. Click. The line went dead. The dial tone hummed in her ear, a flat, monotonous sound of absolute abandonment. Maya slowly lowered the phone. She stared at the receiver in her hand. They had cut her loose. The agency she had bled for, the country she had killed for, they had traded her safety for a political favor. She dropped the phone. It dangled by its cord, swinging gently in the night breeze. She looked down at her torn dress, her bleeding feet, her bruised wrists. For the first time in her life, Maya Vance was truly alone. No backup, no extraction, no badge. A tear leaked from her eye, tracking through the dirt on her cheek. But as it fell, something inside her hardened. The steel that had been forged in black sites and war zones didn't break. It cooled. She wiped the tear away with a bloody hand. "Stand down," she whispered to the darkness. She looked toward the diner where she knew Ben Carter would be waiting. "No," she said. "I don't think I will." Peterson had made a mistake. He thought by cutting her loose, he was neutralizing the threat. He forgot that a ghost with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous weapon on Earth. Maya turned and walked toward the diner. It was time to make the call she should have made in the beginning. It was time to call the guillotine. The neon sign of the Rusty Spoon flickered with a dying buzz, casting an intermittent, sickly pink glow over the alleyway. Maya emerged from the shadows, her feet leaving bloody footprints on the cracked pavement. Ben Carter was waiting in the booth nearest the back exit, just as the note had promised. He looked exactly like his reputation, a man who lived on caffeine and conspiracy theories. He wore a rumpled tweed jacket that had seen better decades, and his hair was a chaotic mess of graying curls. He was nursing a black coffee, his eyes darting nervously toward the door every time the bell chimed. When the back door creaked open and Maya slipped inside, Ben choked on his coffee. He stared at her, his mouth hanging open. He didn't see the composed, professional woman described in the intel he'd received from Davis. He saw a specter. Her expensive red dress was shredded, held together by sheer will and dirt. Her feet were bare and bleeding. Her wrists were encircled by angry, purple-black rings of bruised flesh where the steel cuffs had bitten deep. "My God," Ben whispered, sliding out of the booth to help her. "Miss Vance? Is that you?" Maya waved him off, sliding into the booth opposite him. She didn't want pity. She wanted a war room. "Sit down, Ben," she said, her voice raspy but commanding. "We don't have time for shock." Ben sat, his eyes wide. "Davis told me it was bad. He didn't tell me it was this. Did they do this to you?" "They did," Maya confirmed. She reached into the tattered remains of her bodice and unclipped the pearl button. She placed the tiny device on the Formica table between them. It looked innocuous, like a piece of costume jewelry. "This is everything," Maya said. "From the moment Miller stopped me to the moment Chief Evans walked into my cell and threatened to make me disappear. It's all there. Racketeering, planting evidence, conspiracy to commit murder, judicial bribery." Ben stared at the button as if it were a radioactive isotope. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked it up. "Do you have a way to play this?" Maya asked. Ben nodded, fumbling in his messenger bag. He pulled out a laptop heavy with encryption software and stickers from various press freedom organizations. He connected the device via a specialized reader. He put on his headphones. He listened for 30 seconds. His face went pale. Then it turned red. He ripped the headphones off. "Jesus," Ben breathed. "Evans, he admits to burning down the construction site. He admits to owning the judges. This isn't just a story, Ms. Vance. This is a nuke. If I publish this, the state government will collapse." "That's the plan," Maya said. "But publishing takes time. You need to verify. You need editors. You need legal clearance." She leaned forward, her dark eyes locking onto his. "I don't have time, Ben. They are hunting me. Peterson, my handler at the CIA, just disavowed me. He threw me to the wolves to protect a political alliance. I am alone." Ben looked at her, seeing the desperation behind the steel. "What do you need? A safe house? I have a cousin in Vermont." Maya shook her head. A strange transformation was taking place in her posture. The slump of the victim was vanishing. Her spine straightened. Her chin lifted. The pain in her eyes was replaced by a cold, ancient fury. She wasn't Agent Vance anymore. The CIA had stripped her of that title when they hung up the phone. She was someone else now. She was returning to her roots. "I don't need a safe house," Maya said, her voice dropping an octave, resonating with a terrifying calm. "I need a phone, a burner, untraceable." Ben blinked, surprised by the shift in her energy. He reached into his bag and produced a cheap plastic flip phone. "I always keep two. Fully charged." Maya took the phone. She didn't dial immediately. She held it in her hand, staring at the keypad. She had spent her entire adult life trying to step out of the shadow of her last name. She had joined the agency to be Maya, not Vance. She had fought to prove she could survive on her own merits, without the crushing weight of her father's reputation protecting her. But Oak Creek didn't care about her merits. They didn't care about her service. They only cared about power. "Fine," Maya thought, her thumb hovering over the one. "If they want a monster, I'll give them the king of monsters." She dialed a number she hadn't called in 3 years. A number that didn't go to a house or a cell phone, but to a secure priority line that bypassed the switchboards of the United States Department of Justice. Washington, D.C., 10:45 a.m. The conference room on the top floor of the J. Edgar Hoover building was a fortress of mahogany and silence. The air conditioning hummed, chilling the room to a crisp 68 degrees. Seated around the massive oval table were the most powerful law enforcement officials in the Western Hemisphere: the director of the FBI, the deputy attorney general, the head of the DEA. They were deep in a briefing regarding a multinational cartel operation moving fentanyl through the port of Miami. At the head of the table sat Jonathan Vance. He was 60 years old, but he looked like he had been carved from granite. He wore a charcoal suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His hair was silver, swept back, and his eyes were the color of steel. He was the United States federal prosecutor, but in the halls of D.C., he was known simply as the guillotine. He was a man who didn't negotiate plea deals. He exacted judgments. He was in the middle of dismantling the DEA director's argument about jurisdiction when a sound cut through the room. Bzzz, bzzz. It was a simple, standard ringtone, coming from the inside pocket of Jonathan's suit jacket. The room froze. Everyone knew the rule: no phones in the secure briefing room, especially not Jonathan Vance's phone. Jonathan stopped speaking. He frowned. Only 5 people on the planet had this number. 2 of them were the president and the vice president. One was his wife, the other was his daughter. He held up a hand, silencing the DEA director mid-sentence. He pulled the cheap burner phone he kept for emergencies out of his pocket. "Excuse me," Jonathan said. His voice was deep, gravelly, and brooked no argument. He answered. "This line is secure. Speak." "Dad?" The voice on the other end was faint, tinny, and laced with a pain that Jonathan Vance had never heard before. Jonathan's face, usually an unreadable mask of stoicism, twitched. He stood up slowly, walking toward the bulletproof window that overlooked the Capitol. "Maya?" he asked, his voice softening imperceptibly. "Where are you? Why are you calling this line?" I'm in trouble, Dad," Maya whispered. "I'm in a town called Oak Creek, in Georgia." "Trouble?" Jonathan asked. "Is it an op? Do you need me to call Langley?" "Langley cut me loose," Maya said, her voice breaking. "Peterson disavowed me. He left me here." Jonathan's hand tightened on the phone. The plastic creaked. "Why?" "Because the local police chief is politically connected," Maya said. Dad, they arrested me. False charges. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. Arrested you? For what? There was a pause on the line, a hesitation that terrified him more than any threat of nuclear war. They ripped my dress, Dad, Maya whispered. The silence that followed was absolute. What did you say? Jonathan asked. His voice was no longer soft. It was a low, seismic rumble, like the shifting of tectonic plates before an earthquake. The officer, Maya said, her voice gaining strength, fueled by the connection to her father. He ripped my dress off in the middle of the street. He stripped me to my bra. He cuffed me so tight my wrists are bleeding. He dragged me through the station half naked. She took a breath, a shuddering sound. They laughed, Dad. They laughed at me. And when I tried to warn them, the chief told me I would disappear if I didn't sign a confession. He told me I was nobody. In the conference room, the FBI director watched Jonathan Vance's back. He saw the prosecutor's shoulders rise and fall in a slow, deep breath. He saw the hand holding the phone turn white at the knuckles. He had known Jonathan Vance for 20 years. He had seen him send men to the electric chair without blinking, but he had never ever seen the aura of pure, concentrated violence that was now radiating from the man. "Are you safe right now?" Jonathan asked. His voice was terrifyingly calm. It was the eye of the storm. "I escaped," Maya said. "I'm with a journalist. I have them on tape, Dad. Everything. But they're hunting me." "Listen to me, Maya," Jonathan said. Every word was precise, weighted with the authority of God. "You do not run anymore. You do not hide. You are a Vance." "I know," she whispered. "I want you to sit in that diner," Jonathan commanded. "Order a coffee. Wait. Do not engage. Do not fight. You have done enough." "What are you going to do?" Maya asked. Jonathan looked at his reflection in the glass. He didn't see a prosecutor. He saw a father whose child had been violated. "They tore your dress," he repeated, almost to himself. The image burned into his brain, his brilliant, strong daughter, humiliated by small men with badges. "Dad?" "Do nothing," Jonathan said. "I am coming, and I am bringing the wrath of God with me." He hung up the phone. He stood there for a moment, staring at the Washington Monument. Then he turned back to the table. The room was silent. The heads of the FBI, DEA, and DOJ waited. Jonathan walked back to his chair. He didn't sit. He began packing his files into his briefcase with deliberate, sharp movements. "Jonathan?" the Attorney General's deputy asked tentatively. "The cartel briefing." "The cartel is canceled," Jonathan said. His voice was ice. He looked up, his steel eyes sweeping the room. "Director," he said to the head of the FBI, "I need the hostage rescue team, the Alpha Squad. I want them wheels up in 20 minutes. The director blinked. "Jonathan, HRT is for national security threats. We can't just—" "I need the U.S. Marshals SOG unit," Jonathan continued, ignoring the interruption. "I need the DOJ Civil Rights Task Force, the aggressive one, and I want a federal warrant for every square inch of the Oak Creek Police Department." "On what grounds?" the deputy AG asked, stunned. Jonathan slammed his briefcase shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "On the grounds that a corrupt police department has unlawfully detained, assaulted, and tortured a federal intelligence officer," Jonathan declared. "On the grounds of racketeering, conspiracy, and deprivation of rights under color of law." He leaned over the table, placing both hands on the mahogany. He looked like a titan ready to tear the roof off the building. "They assaulted my daughter," Jonathan said. The room went deathly still. "They stripped her in the street, and now I am going to strip them of everything they have." He looked at the map on the screen, the cartel map. He pointed a finger at it, but he was pointing at a ghost town in Georgia. "I don't want an investigation," Jonathan growled. "I want a decapitation strike. I want that police department wiped off the legal map by sundown. I want their badges. I want their pensions. I want their freedom." He straightened up and buttoned his jacket. "Gentlemen," Jonathan Vance said, heading for the door, "we are going to war. Try to keep up." Back in the diner, Maya handed the phone back to Ben Carter. She picked up her coffee cup. Her hand was steady. "What did he say?" Ben asked, looking terrified by the one-sided conversation he had just witnessed. Maya looked out the window toward the dark road leading into Oak Creek. She took a sip of the bitter coffee. "He said to wait," Maya replied. "Wait for what?" Maya smiled. It was the smile of the ghost, finally reunited with her power. "For the end of the world," she said. 05:59 a.m. Oak Creek lay swaddled in the pre-dawn mist, a blanket of silence covering the sins of the night before. The streetlights flickered off, one by one, surrendering to the creeping gray of morning. In the driveways of the mansions, sprinklers hissed to life, a rhythmic domestic sound that masked the approaching storm. At the edge of town, the birds stopped singing. It started as a vibration in the ground, a low-frequency tremor that rattled the teacups in the china cabinets of the wealthy. Then came the sound. It wasn't the gentle hum of traffic, it was the aggressive, chopping roar of military-grade aviation. 6 a.m. The sky above Oak Creek turned black. 3 UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters, painted in matte black without markings, tore through the cloud cover. They didn't fly high. They skimmed the treetops, their rotors churning the mist into a violent vortex. The sound was deafening, a physical assault that woke the entire town in a heartbeat. Simultaneously, the main road leading into Oak Creek, usually reserved for luxury sedans and delivery trucks, was seized. A convoy of 20 Chevrolet Suburbans, their windows tinted to an impenetrable obsidian, roared into town. They moved in a V formation, driving with a terrifying, synchronized precision. These weren't local police cruisers. They didn't use sirens. They used speed and mass. Blue strobes flashed silently behind their grills, the signal of federal authority. The convoy split. One group peeled off toward the police precinct. Another headed for the affluent hills. The third, led by a vehicle bearing the seal of the United States Department of Justice, headed for the low-rent apartment complex on the outskirts of town. The decapitation strike had begun. Target 1. The King's Castle Chief Evans slept the sleep of the unrighteous. He was dreaming of his retirement villa in the Caymans, bought with the money skimmed from the evidence locker. He was warm, comfortable, and secure in the belief that he was untouchable. He woke to the sound of the apocalypse. The front door of his sprawling colonial mansion didn't just open, it disintegrated. A battering ram, wielded by a U.S. Marshal with the dimensions of a linebacker, turned the mahogany wood into splinters. Boom. "Federal agents! Search warrant!" The shout came from everywhere at once. Flashbang grenades rolled into the foyer, detonating with blinding white light and a concussion that shattered the expensive vase on the hallway table. Evans scrambled out of bed, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He stumbled into the hallway, still wearing his silk paisley pajamas, his eyes bleary and confused. "What is the meaning of this?" Evans screamed, his voice cracking. "I am the chief of police! Get out of my house!" He reached for the pistol he kept in his nightstand, but a red laser dot appeared on his chest. Then another. Then 5. He froze. At the bottom of the stairs stood a dozen men in full tactical gear. Their vests read FBI and DOJ. They weren't looking at him with the deference his own officers showed. They were looking at him like he was a contagion. "Get on the ground, now!" Evans hesitated. His ego wouldn't allow him to kneel in his own home. "Do you know who I am?" Evans roared, trying to summon the authority that had ruled Oak Creek for a decade. "I will have your badges. I know the governor." A tall agent in a windbreaker stepped forward. He moved up the stairs with fluid grace, holstering his weapon. He grabbed Evans by the collar of his silk pajamas and slammed him against the wall. "The governor isn't answering his phone today, Chief," the agent said. He shoved a piece of paper into Evans's chest. Warrant for arrest, racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping a federal officer, obstruction of justice. Evans stared at the paper. His eyes scanned down to the bottom, looking for the signature of the local judge he owned. He expected to see Judge Miller or Judge Holloway. Instead, he saw a signature written in sharp, aggressive ink. A signature that was feared in every courtroom in America. Jonathan Vance, United States Federal Prosecutor. The blood drained from Evans's face so fast he nearly fainted. The paper slipped from his fingers. Vance? He whispered. The guillotine? You messed with his daughter, the agent said, spinning Evans around. He kicked Evans' legs apart and slapped the cuffs on. These weren't the loose, friendly cuffs of a professional courtesy. They were tight. You're not going to county jail, Evans, the agent whispered in his ear as he hauled him toward the stairs. You're going to federal holding. And you're going to sing. They dragged him out the front door. The neighbors were watching, the doctors, the lawyers, the tech CEOs. They watched as the man who claimed to own the town was paraded down his driveway in pajamas, barefoot and broken. The king of Oak Creek had fallen. Target 2. The architect. 300 miles away, in the sterile, glass-walled headquarters of the CIA in Langley, Virginia, Director Peterson was enjoying his morning espresso. He was reviewing a file on a potential asset in Berlin, feeling satisfied with how he had handled the Vance situation. He had cut the loose end. It was clean. It was professional. His office door opened. Peterson didn't look up. Susan, I told you, hold my calls. It's not Susan. Peterson looked up. Standing in his doorway was the deputy director of the FBI, flanked by 2 agents from the office of the Inspector General. Peterson put his coffee cup down slowly. To what do I owe the pleasure? Stand up, Peterson, the deputy director said. There was no warmth in his voice. Step away from the computer. Excuse me? Peterson stood, his face flushing. I am a director of operations. You don't walk into my office and... You are a suspect in a federal investigation involving the abandonment and endangerment of a field operative, the deputy director interrupted, and conspiracy to obstruct a DOJ investigation. One of the agents moved around the desk, unplugging Peterson's terminal. The other moved toward him. You cut an agent loose, the deputy director said, his voice dripping with disgust. You left her to die in a corrupt precinct to protect a kickback scheme. We have the recordings, Peterson. We have the call log. Peterson's arrogance wavered. She was unstable. I made a command decision. You made a career-ending decision. The agent reached out and ripped the security badge from Peterson's lanyard. He took the ID card from his wallet. Escort him out, the deputy director ordered. Public exit. Let everyone see. You can't do this, Peterson sputtered as they grabbed his arms. I have clearance. I have secrets. You have the right to remain silent, the agent recited, spinning him around. As they marched him through the bustling bullpen of the CIA, heads turned. Analysts stopped typing. Operations officers stared. Peterson, the man who prided himself on being the puppet master, was being dragged out like a common criminal. His career didn't end with a bang. It ended with the squeak of his loafers on the polished floor and the quiet click of a security turnstile locking him out forever. Target 3. The monster. The climax. The sun had fully risen over the dilapidated apartment complex on the south side of Oak Creek. It was a stark contrast to the manicured lawns of the north side. Here, the grass was dead and the paint was peeling. Officer Frank Miller stepped out of his ground-floor unit, scratching his stomach. He was wearing jeans and a polo shirt, his badge clipped to his belt. He was whistling. He felt good. He felt powerful. He had broken the girl. She had escaped, sure, but she was running. She was scared. And Evans had promised him a promotion for handling the situation. He was going to be Sergeant Miller soon. He walked toward his personal truck, swinging his keys on his finger. He was thinking about breakfast, maybe pancakes. He stopped. A shadow fell over him. He looked up. The whistling died in his throat. Parked in a semicircle around his truck were 5 black Suburbans. The engines were idling with a menacing, low rumble. Miller frowned. "What the hell?" He took a step forward, his hand instinctively moving to his hip, toward his off-duty weapon. Zip, zip, zip. Red dots appeared on his chest. 1, 2, 3, 10. Miller froze. He looked down at his shirt. It looked like he was covered in measles of light. He looked up, squinting into the sun. On the roof of the opposite building, he saw the silhouettes of snipers. On the balconies above him, men in tactical gear were training rifles on his head. "Police!" Miller shouted, his voice shaking. "I'm an officer! Don't shoot!" The door of the lead Suburban opened. A man stepped out. He didn't wear tactical gear. He didn't wear a windbreaker with big yellow letters. He wore a bespoke black suit that absorbed the light. His white shirt was crisp, his tie knotted with geometric perfection. He moved with a slow, terrifying elegance. Jonathan Vance buttoned his jacket as he walked toward Miller. He didn't look like a lawyer. He looked like the angel of death. Miller's breath caught in his throat. He recognized the man, not from Oak Creek, but from the news, from the television. "Vance?" Miller whispered. The name tasted like ash. Jonathan stopped 10 feet from Miller. He stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides. His eyes were not angry. They were empty. They were the eyes of a man who was about to extinguish a candle. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the wind and the distant thrum of the helicopters circling the perimeter. "You like power, don't you, Officer Miller?" Jonathan asked. His voice was soft, but it carried across the parking lot with perfect clarity. Miller tried to speak, but his throat was dry. He nodded, a jerky, involuntary motion. "You like to make people feel small," Jonathan continued, taking a step closer. "You like to rip things that are beautiful. You like to put people in cages." Miller's eyes darted to the agents surrounding him. They weren't moving. They were waiting for a command from this man in the suit. Miller stammered. "It was a misunderstanding. She resisted." "She," Jonathan interrupted, his voice dropping to a glacial whisper, "is my daughter." Miller's world stopped. The woman in the red dress. The woman he had stripped. The woman he had mocked. Daughter. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't just assaulted a civilian. He had assaulted the child of the most dangerous prosecutor in the United States. "Oh, God," Miller whimpered. Jonathan took another step. He was in Miller's personal space now, invading it just as Miller had invaded Maya's. "You told her she needed to learn her place," Jonathan said. "You told her you would show her real authority." Jonathan spread his arms wide, gesturing to the snipers, the armored vehicles, the dozens of federal agents with their fingers on the triggers. "Look around you, Frank," Jonathan said. "This is real authority." He leaned in, his face inches from Miller's. Miller could see the flecks of gray in Jonathan's steel eyes. He could smell the expensive soap and the scent of absolute, terrifying control. "You are not a king," Jonathan whispered. "You are a worm, and I am the boot." Miller began to tremble. His knees knocked together. The bravado, the arrogance, the racism, it all evaporated, leaving behind a small, pathetic man who was realizing he was about to be crushed. "Please," Miller begged, tears leaking from his eyes. "I didn't know, I swear." "Ignorance is not a defense," Jonathan said. "It is a liability." He looked down at Miller's pants. A dark stain was spreading across the front of Miller's jeans. The terror had overwhelmed his body's basic functions. He was wetting himself, right there in the parking lot, in front of the federal government. Jonathan looked at the stain with a curl of disgust on his lip. "Pathetic," Jonathan said. He turned his back on Miller. He didn't even bother to touch him. He wasn't worth the effort. "Take him," Jonathan ordered. The command unleashed the dogs. 4 agents surged forward. They didn't treat Miller with professional courtesy. They hit him like a freight train. Miller was slammed into the pavement, face first. His nose crunched against the asphalt. A boot pressed onto his neck, pinning him down. "Frank Miller!" an agent shouted. "You are under arrest for deprivation of rights, assault with intent to commit a felony, and racketeering." They wrenched his arms behind his back. The cuffs went on, not the loose fit Miller gave his friends, but the tight, biting fit he had given Maya. Miller screamed as they hauled him up. He was crying openly now, snot running down his face, his pants soaked. "Mr. Vance! Please!" Miller shrieked as they dragged him toward the Suburban. Jonathan didn't turn around. He walked back to his car, checking his watch. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Maya," Jonathan said, his voice instantly softening, returning to the tone of a father. "It's done." "Is he?" Maya's voice came through, hesitant. "He is finished," Jonathan said, looking at the sobbing wreck of a man being thrown into the back of a federal transport vehicle. "They are all finished." The helicopter overhead banked sharply, heading back to base. The raid was over. The town of Oak Creek had been purged. Jonathan got into his car. "I'm coming to get you," he said. "We're going home." 6 months later. The federal courthouse in Atlanta was a cathedral of stone and silence, a stark contrast to the grimy, pine-sol-scented hallways of the Oak Creek precinct. Here the air smelled of floor wax and the crushing weight of inevitable consequences. The courtroom was packed, not with curiosity seekers, but with the victims of Oak Creek, the families who had been extorted, the young men who had been framed, the business owners whose livelihoods had been burned to the ground. They sat in the gallery, a silent jury of the people, watching the final act of their liberation. At the prosecution table stood Jonathan Vance. He did not pace. He did not shout. He stood like a statue, his voice filling the room with the quiet, devastating precision of a surgeon cutting out a tumor. "Your Honor," Jonathan said, looking directly at the defendants, "these men did not just break the law. They wore the law as a disguise to commit crimes against the very people they swore to protect. They are not officers. They are predators." At the defense table, Frank Miller and his partner Reed sat in orange federal jumpsuits. They were shackled at the waist and ankles. Miller had lost 30 pounds. His skin was gray, hanging loosely on his frame. The arrogance that had fueled his brutality on the sidewalk was gone, replaced by the hollow, haunted look of a man who knows he is never going home. When the judge asked if Miller had anything to say, the former officer tried to stand, but his legs shook so violently the marshals had to support him. He opened his mouth, but no words came out, only a dry, pathetic sob. The gavel fell. Bang! "Frank Miller," the judge announced, his voice devoid of pity. "For deprivation of rights under color of law, kidnapping and racketeering, you are sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. You will be remanded to the custody of the Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado. ADX Florence, the Supermax, the Alcatraz of the Rockies." Miller wasn't just going to jail. He was going to a concrete box in the ground for the rest of his natural life. Reed received 25 years. As Miller was dragged out of the courtroom wailing, he looked back one last time. He scanned the front row, looking for Maya Vance. She was there. She sat next to her father, wearing a pristine white suit. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply watched him with the detached indifference of a woman watching garbage being taken out to the curb. Justice wasn't emotional for her anymore. It was completed paperwork. The cleansing of Oak Creek. The conviction was just the first domino. Chief Evans, terrified by the prospect of dying in prison, had turned state's evidence within 48 hours of his arrest. He sang loud and clear. He gave up the judges who took bribes. He gave up the state senators who laundered money through the police benevolent fund. He gave up the contractors who built the precinct with kickback money. Based on Evans's testimony and the Vance tapes, as Maya's recording became known, the Department of Justice launched the largest civil rights review in Georgia's history. Jonathan Vance established a dedicated hotline, the Oak Creek Justice Initiative. The phones didn't stop ringing for weeks. Hundreds of cases were reopened. Wrongful convictions were overturned. Fathers who had been sent away on planted drug charges were released, walking out of prison gates into the arms of weeping children. Property seized under false pretenses was returned. The Oak Creek Police Department was not reformed. It was dissolved. The building itself, the fortress of gray brick where Maya had been tortured, was gutted. The DOJ seized it under asset forfeiture laws. It was stripped of its cells, its interrogation rooms, and its secrets. It was currently being renovated into a community legal aid center and a library. A new law enforcement agency was built from the ground up, with federal oversight embedded in its DNA. And leading that new agency was a familiar face. Officer Davis, the young man who had risked everything to slide a note under a sandwich stood on the steps of the town hall. He wasn't wearing the old, tainted uniform of Oak Creek. He wore a new uniform, crisp and clean. He raised his right hand, his voice trembling slightly with emotion as he took the oath of office. He wasn't just an officer anymore. He was the interim sheriff, handpicked by the federal monitor to guide the town back to the light. Maya watched the ceremony from the back of the crowd. She saw the way the community looked at Davis not with fear, but with a tentative, growing hope. He had saved her. Now, he was saving them. The final scene. Washington, D.C. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of cherry blossoms from the Potomac. Maya stood on the balcony of her father's penthouse apartment, a glass of wine in her hand. The city lights twinkled below, a grid of power and history. She felt light. The bruises on her wrists had faded to faint yellow echoes. The cuts on her feet had healed. But the memory was there, etched into her psyche not as a trauma, but as a scar of battle. The sliding glass door opened. Jonathan Vance stepped out. He had traded his suit for a cashmere sweater, looking less like the guillotine and more like a father. "It's quiet tonight," Jonathan said, leaning on the railing beside her. "It is," Maya agreed. "Peterson was formally indicted today," Jonathan mentioned casually, sipping his scotch. "Obstruction of justice. He'll lose his pension. He'll likely do 5 years. "Good," Maya said. She didn't feel a surge of triumph, just the satisfaction of balance being restored. She turned to look back into the living room. On the wall, mounted in a stark, black shadow box frame, was the dress. The crimson silk was tattered, ripped down the center, stained with the mud of the Oak Creek sidewalk and the red wine of that afternoon. It looked violent. It looked tragic. But it also looked beautiful. It was no longer just a piece of clothing. It was a war flag. Jonathan followed her gaze. "You know," he said softly, "most people would have burned that." "I thought about it," Maya admitted. "I wanted to forget it ever happened. I wanted to erase the moment he put his hands on me." She took a sip of wine, the taste rich and complex on her tongue. "But then I realized," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "that dress isn't a symbol of what they did to me. It's a symbol of what they couldn't do." "They couldn't break you," Jonathan said. "No," Maya replied. "They couldn't make me disappear." She turned back to the city, her silhouette framed against the glow of the Capitol dome. The camera pulled back slowly, framing father and daughter against the skyline, the framed dress visible in the background like a silent sentinel. Voiceover monologue, Maya Vance. "They tell you that justice is blind, but I have learned that justice must see. It must see the ugly, the broken, and the corrupt. For a long time, I thought justice was about punishment. It was about seeing Frank Miller in chains, about seeing a corrupt chief dragged out of his mansion in pajamas. And there is satisfaction in that, I won't lie. But true justice isn't about revenge. Revenge is for the past. Justice is for the future. Justice is the moment a father walks out of prison to hold his daughter again. Justice is a young officer choosing conscience over loyalty. Justice is a town learning to breathe again without fear. And for me, justice is the simple, quiet freedom to walk down a street on a Tuesday afternoon. It is the freedom to wear a red silk dress, to look beautiful, to feel safe, and to know that I can go anywhere I choose without permission. Justice is knowing that no matter what badge they wear, no matter how loud they shout, they can never, ever tell me to know my place again. Because I know my place. My place is standing tall. And anyone who tries to knock me down will have to answer to the storm. Fade to black.